Okay, friends, just a quick note to tell you that this last episode of our birth story series, it's actually going to end up being split into two. It was just really long, and I try to keep my episodes to around the 30-minute mark. So the Twinbies birth story will be a bit of a cliffhanger, and it's going to be a very abrupt cliffhanger because I was not planning on going as long as I did, but hey, the story goes how the story goes. So since it ended up being well over an hour, we're giving you 2 episodes of content. And so when you hear me stop, I'll just come back and let you know that you can come back next week and get the rest of the story. But don't be alarmed because it will end. I promise. All good stories have to. Hello and welcome to the Emma's for Mama podcast. I'm your host, Abbie Halberstadt, happy wife, mama to 10, Bible-believing Christian, and we are finishing up our birth series with today's episode. And some of you are just going boo-hoo and so sad about it because you're birth story junkies. But the good news is, for the true birth story junkie, you could just start over at the beginning and do it all over again because the people that truly love these can listen to them again and again without losing interest. And those of you who just enjoyed it on the first round, we're going to move on to a new topic next week. So look forward to that. But we're going to finish up with the Twinbies birth story. Now, I get asked fairly often why we call them the Twinbies. And it's because we have 2 sets of twins, and we call the twin sisters the Twinsies, and we call the twin brothers the Twinbies, just as a way of easily delineating between the two. And I'll be completely honest, we don't call the twin sisters Twinsies as often as we call the younger ones the Twinbies, but the Twinbies really is what we call them as a unit. Yes, we call them by their names, Titus and Tobias, or Toby as we affectionately call him, or Tubbers or Chubbers, because he's the larger of the 2 twins, as we even more affectionately call him. But we call them the Twinbies when we are talking about them as a little unit in our family and an easy way of figuring out who we're talking about. So their birth story is unique in that it is the only hospital twin birth I've had. But if you remember, I have had one other hospital birth, and that was my first, Ezra. So it's pretty common, and I think I talked about this in the first podcast. If I didn't, I'll say it now, that with people who end up having home births later, that their first birth is a hospital birth because maybe they didn't have any research that they'd done into home birthing or birth center birthing or any kind of alternative birthing. Maybe they had a husband who was nervous about it, or a mom who was nervous about it, or just a community that felt like it would be unsafe for the first go around, or maybe unsafe at all. And then they got used to the concept, and even if their community continued to feel that way, decided to home birth. Again, I'm not really advocating for one over the other, but I'm just saying in the experience, a lot of times it's common that the first time you have a baby, you go kind of the more conventional route. And then if you decide to go a different route, you adjust because of your experience. And if you remember my talking about Ezra, I didn't have a bad experience with the hospital. I went in and got sent home after being in pretty mild labor for about 24 hours. Never stopped contracting, never slept, but wasn't about to have a baby, that's for sure. I have a friend from many years ago who did his rotation in the, what is this called? In mother baby care, and in labor and delivery. That's the word I'm looking for. In labor and delivery. And he's a guy, so he's never going to experience the pain of childbirth or the discomfort of pregnancy at the very end, especially. And I remember he kind of jokingly was talking about how the mamas would come in wearing their cute little overalls and, their pregnancy overalls, and their hair was up, and they had, accessories and their makeup on. And he and his fellow, calloused residents would look at each other and say, that woman is not ready to have a baby. And then later on, she would come in and the ponytail was, half falling down her head, and one of the buckles of her overall straps was undone and hanging off of her, and her makeup had run off her face from crying. And they're like, oh, now she's ready to have a baby. And many years later, I didn't have children at the time, but I remember his telling that story. I think, okay, where's your compassion, dude? But he's not wrong. So even I knew with that first baby that going into the hospital, I was not ready to have a baby. I thought, there is no way that I am about to have a human being come out of my body. I'm just not in enough pain. So I got sent home, came back later, was at the hospital for about 6 hours total before I had him. He came out in like 2 pushes. It was a hard labor because I did it in a bed. You can hear about all the details in that first podcast. But really, it was the 24 hours that I was there afterwards that made me think, I'd rather do this somewhere else. I'd rather be in my own bed. I'd rather be able to eat what I want to eat. I don't want to be woken up. I don't want to be offered pills that I don't want. I don't want to be poked or prodded. I don't want to have my baby taken away from me. Like, I wasn't a crunchy mom. I wasn't trying to be holistic. I just kind of felt like I would enjoy the experience more. And I've heard from so many moms that are like, what are you talking about? They bring you juice and ice chips and they take the baby and they take them to the nursery and it's like going to a spa and it's amazing. And I fully respect that opinion as well, because I don't think it's a moral thing. But all of that to say that I preface this birth story with the fact that I had chosen to have home births. And then if y'all have listened to Shiloh's birth from last week, you know that that one ended up being in a birth center, but pretty much accidentally. I just didn't want to go home and sit in my quiet house and freak out and have my body go into panic mode anymore. So I stayed there and it worked. Had a beautiful labor and a beautiful baby boy come out of that experience. So was fine with that. But I would have preferred another home birth for any future children because that's kind of my jam. So I find out that I am pregnant in January of 2020. And I remember that it was January, specifically, it was the very end, because we had a party for my husband's 40th birthday. And I had been suspecting pregnancy for a little while. And I can't even remember exactly why, but I was getting negative pregnancy tests. And I'd had like 4 negative pregnancy tests. And I didn't really have any symptoms, but I just remember, for whatever reason, feeling pretty sure that I was pregnant. But those negative pregnancy tests keep you guessing, right? Well, on the afternoon of the prep for my husband's 40th birthday party, we just had friends coming over to play games and eat dinner. I'm making hamburger sliders and dip, and I just get struck by this huge pang of nausea, and I think, yep, I'm definitely pregnant. And I took a test, I think the next morning, and it was positive. Very faintly so, but it was positive. And so I don't remember. I think I would have been about 4 weeks pregnant at that point, including the 2 weeks of gestation that they include to, roll into a 28-day cycle. And I've talked about the fact that I tend to have a little bit longer cycles, or at least did in the past. They're not terribly long now. And so I think I probably would have been somewhere at the 4-week mark. And that's pretty late for me to get a pregnancy test positive, to be completely honest. Mine is usually at the 3-week mark, 2 to 3 week mark, depending on how you look at it. And so I got the positive pregnancy test, and people always ask me, do you know that it's twins? I've been pregnant with twins 3 separate times. Have you had the symptoms to know that it's twins? And to be completely honest, with Abbie and Nola, I really didn't have any symptoms at the beginning. I wasn't even sure I believed I was pregnant because I did not feel pregnant. I was 6 weeks and had no exhaustion, no nausea, no anything. And I know that it really kicks in around the 6-week mark for many people, but I hadn't had anything. So I was doubting myself. So definitely not stronger symptoms in the beginning. Later on, yes, but in the beginning, no. With Theo having a twin, we had vanishing twin syndrome with him, and I didn't have any telltale signs, I wouldn't say. I wasn't getting bigger faster, and we didn't have his sonogram until 11 weeks, which is very early, but it's still plenty of time to have gotten bigger faster and to have had the stronger symptoms, and I really didn't. And then with Titus and Toby, I wouldn't necessarily say that I was thinking that my symptoms were twin-like necessarily. I think I did start getting nauseated, at that 3 or 4 week mark, whatever it was, on Sean's birthday party. And it stayed for longer, but I also had noticed that I got nauseated earlier with Shiloh and with Honor, and I just kind of chalked that up to my body getting older and experiencing symptoms more acutely. So it really wasn't significant enough to be like, this is twins for sure. And I'm giving you all of this background even though it's not a birth story yet, because it does have bearing on where we're going with this birth story in the future. And what I told you at the very end of Shiloh's birth, which is that I really feel like the fact that he was born in a birth center when I wasn't planning on having him in a birth center was the Lord setting me up for where the Twinbies would be born, which was, of course, a hospital for only the second time. And I was very resistant. But when I found out I was having twins, one of the very first things, I had actually already called my midwife about being pregnant. And so she knew I was pregnant with one. And then we had a sonogram at 13 weeks, found out that we were pregnant with two. And people, again, assume that I must have had some inkling. And I will say this, when we drove up to the sonogram center and I was sitting in the car and Sean said, "Are you ready to get out?" You know, usually you're excited. And I felt really nervous and kind of stressed. And that's not like me usually. I'm not typically a worrier. Obviously, if you listen to Shiloh's birth story, you know that I'm capable of anxiety, but that was a little bit of a different situation. So as far as like worrying that something's going to be wrong or really stressing and dwelling on that, I normally don't. And so he looked at me and said, "What's the deal? You seem something." And I said, "I don't know. I feel like something is either wrong or it's going to be twins." And I'm not equating wrong with twins at all, but twins are a lot. The pregnancy is hard. The delivery is a question mark, and the newborn stage is really hard. So I'm like, okay, I kind of feel like I have to mentally prep myself for this. So we prayed before we went in for peace and calm. And when she put the wand on my belly and there was one baby in there and she was looking, and even at 13 weeks, she was like, "I'm pretty sure this is a boy." And I remember thinking, it wasn't even a fully formed thought, but it was just this brief moment of, if I could have a fully formed thought, it might be, I think I was expecting something else. But then she moved the wand even too quickly for me to really mentally go there. And there was baby number 2. And I was like, there we go. This is that weird niggling feeling that I've been having of something that I can't place my finger on is happening. I don't know if it's something that's going like, it was just such a nebulous thing. I couldn't grasp it until that moment when I saw the second baby. And I was like, that's it. That's what I've been feeling. This is so strange because I am not someone that goes around with premonitions or gut feelings very often. You are not going to hear me say that I'm going to prophesy something or declare something or manifest it. So it was a very surreal feeling to go, this is why I felt unsettled, because somehow I think I knew. But I didn't know. I didn't have the symptoms to know. It's just something was there kind of pinging in the back of my brain. So I call my midwife back and I say, "By the way, I'm not just pregnant. I'm pregnant with another set of twins. Would you do me the honor of being my midwife for twins?" And she actually was in the process of closing down her practice and wasn't accepting new clients, but she had said that she would deliver my singleton baby because I wasn't a new client. And I was very sad about the prospect of her closing. But, you know, you kind of have to let go of this planning your perfect births for the future with your preferred midwife when you are currently pregnant with a set of twins. You just gotta deal with what you have right now. And honestly, that's pretty good advice for life. Dealing with what you have right in front of you without worrying about tomorrow. In fact, Jesus is the one that tells us that when he tells us not to worry about tomorrow because today has enough trouble of its own. And so I asked her if she would do this birth, and she said, "I will, but I need you to know that I am not delivering at home anymore." And that was just a huge blow to me. For those of you that don't do home births, that may not make sense to you, but maybe if you flipped it around, if you don't do home births and someone said, "Okay, you have to deliver at home," and you don't feel prepared to do that. And you're like, "Wait, what? No, that's not what I do." And so she said, "I'm not doing home births anymore." And I said, "Well, I mean, we can do the birth center." And she said, "I'm not actually doing birth center births with twins anymore." So this was specific to multiples. So she had attended my birth with Abbie and Nola, which was an amazing birth. If you guys have listened to that podcast, you know that it went so well, no complications. And once it finally got going was the closest thing I've had to a painless labor. Not painless, but so manageable. And so she had witnessed that and seen it go so well. And she told me over the course of the years, because Abbie and Nola at the time that I was telling her I was pregnant with my second set of twins were, they were 7 years old. Is that correct? Or 8 years old? I have to think about what age they would have been. They are 8 years older than the babies to the day. And so they would have been 7, turning 8. And so she would have delivered them 7 years before. And she said during the course of that time, she had delivered or been present at the birth of another 9, I think she said, sets of multiples. Twins. I don't think there were more than 2. And she said that of those 10 twin births that she had attended, only 2 had gone without any hitches. That nobody had ended up with mortalities or major problems, but they usually ended in the hospital because baby B loves to flip. And it's just this thing with twin pregnancies and twin deliveries that after baby A comes out, baby B gets this vacuum and they flip. Well, that's exactly what Nola, who was my baby B with my girl twins, did. And she came out with double footling breech, but she came out. There was no issue. She didn't get stuck. And so she just said, we've just had too many hospital transfers. They've turned out fine, but it's stressful. And I'm closing my practice, so I'm not going to put myself at that level of risk. So you'll have to do a hospital birth. And I think I'm telling this a little bit backwards because I think that was the first thing she told me, and my heart just sank, not only because I was going to have to deliver in a hospital, but because I think at that point she had not yet told me that she was willing to still be my midwife. So I was thinking, okay, I don't get Melina and I don't get my preferred location. And it felt like being bereaved, like having something cherished taken away from me. And really, the Lord is in the business of being the one that's sovereign and the one that's in control. And I think that there are lots of things, even good things, that we can get attached to that he requires us to pry our fingers off of. And the perfect birth plan or birth story is definitely one of them. He'd already done that for me with Shiloh. And so I felt probably more willing to accept the change of scenery than I would have. I mean, I didn't have a choice, but more willing emotionally and mentally to accept the change of scenery than I would have if I hadn't already had that happen with a birth 2 years before, or actually at that point had not been 2 years. By the time I was telling Melina that I was pregnant, it had probably only been about maybe 15 months, something like that, because Shiloh and the Twinbies are 19 months apart. So I'm mourning this a little bit, but I'm, getting over it. Melina says that she will do something called co-care between her and a traditional OBGYN. She knows someone that's willing to work with her that she's worked with multiple times before, not just with twin pregnancies, but other pregnancies that needed to have a more traditional setting in combination with midwifery. And so she's like, you're going to have the best of both worlds and we're going to make this work. Well, this is 2020. This is the very beginning of 2020. And by this point, they're starting to have pandemic shutdowns. And I know of people who are having babies without their husbands in the room and no one else in the room with them because of the standards that they were holding for people being there that weren't required medical personnel. And I had friends that delivered and their husband had to watch from like a window outside if he got that. And so that felt kind of scary and just a lot of unknowns. And so, as per usual, I started contracting during this pregnancy, probably about halfway through. Tons of Braxton Hicks. It was the hardest pregnancy I've ever had. Had really terrible round ligament pain, struggled with edema. My legs swelled horribly. I kept doing my fitness classes, but I was definitely moving at a slower pace, and I didn't do any impact fitness classes. So by the time I got to the very end of this pregnancy, man, things were feeling heavy, metaphorically and very literally. I remember I would go on walks with my best friend, and normally, we can knock out a 2-mile walk in under 40 minutes, and we're talking and we're doing elevation changes or, incline changes, and it's no big deal. And I remember a 2-mile walk with her probably took us like 50 minutes, and I had to sit down for like 2 hours afterwards at home because my hips felt so disconnected from the rest of my body and were so sore, and I just felt heavy. And it's twins, you are heavy. You have gained a lot of weight, a lot of baby weight, a lot of fluid, and a lot of, weight in there too to support these 2 babies. So my doctor, who was, I wouldn't necessarily say she was more naturally minded than some traditional OBGYNs, but she was more hands off in the sense that she would say things to me like, your body has shown that you can have babies, that you don't have any medical history of issues, and that you're not going to stall. I mean, I stall in labor sometimes, but they eventually come out. And so she's like, your body has proven itself. We're not worried about you. You're a veteran mom. You are a veteran baby carrier. Your pregnancies, have proven themselves to be pretty normal and straightforward for the most part. So we're just going to let you go as far as you want to go. Well, she starts talking about 40 weeks, and I had Abbie and Nola at 39 weeks and 4 days, and I'm like, surely not, Lord. Like, surely I'm not going to 40 weeks. But she's like, we'll just let you go as long as you need to go. And I found her perspective refreshing, because I know that for many care providers, they start worrying about monodi twins, which is what both Abbie and Nola and Titus and Tobias are, by about gestational age 36 weeks. So they consider that a full-term pregnancy for monodi twins, which is 1 placenta, 2 amniotic sacs. They have their own amniotic sacs. And they start pushing for delivery at that point, for induced delivery. And I've never been induced. I've never had Pitocin. I've never had a C-section. I've only ever done this thing where my body eventually goes into labor and eventually has a baby after being in labor for a long time. So the prospect of kind of being hurried up, being taken off the table with this lady being so fine with my going as long as I needed to go was great. But the longer I went in the pregnancy and the more pain I experienced from various, syndromes, I had a very good pregnancy in many ways, but it was hard. It was just, there were no major complications that were threatening to the babies, but it was just hard and painful, and, felt like I had to sometimes lift my legs out of bed. And yeah, it was just hard. That's probably the best phrase for it. And it was good because I was growing 2 babies and I was going to get to meet them. So hard is not the same thing as bad, but it was still really kind of daunting to think of going even one more week once it got to about the 35-week mark. It was just like, okay, make it out of bed today and don't think about it too much. Make it through the end of the day, make it through the end of tomorrow, make it through the end of, one day at a time. So somewhere toward the last month of pregnancy, she started talking about the fact that the care provider over her, she was over my care, but the care provider over her in her practice had reviewed my file and was nervous, not because of anything in my file or anything that was happening with the babies, because each sonogram or each check or each visit to either the midwife or the OBGYN, and I split care between them. So I would do an appointment with the OBGYN, and then I would do an appointment with the midwife, and then I would go back to the OBGYN, and then I would go back to the midwife. Midwife was about 30 minutes away from me. OBGYN was over an hour away. So it was nice to be able to split those between the two, and they just communicated with each other and both kept records, and it worked great. But when I got to the point of, like I said, somewhere around, I think it was around 32 weeks, this care provider who was looking at the files and saying everything's normal, but we have a monodi pregnancy. In my book, a monodi pregnancy means it needs to be done at 36 weeks. And I remember thinking, but I don't want these babies to be in the NICU if they don't have to be. And yes, this is hard on my body, but I want them to stay in there a good amount of time to be able to grow like they need to grow. And so my doctor, my OBGYN, didn't start putting pressure on me, but she started asking questions like, how would you feel if 38 weeks was kind of where we decided to start talking about induction? Well, normally, again, there are going to be people that are very naturally minded, and I tend to be more that way with labor for sure, and in many other areas as well. But there are going to be people that are diehards that are going to be shocked that I would even consider induction. But the Lord kind of sometimes loosens up your grip on things you don't even think you're supposed to have loosened up. And I had started to consider the possibility of induction because Abbie and Nola had been praying forever, for months, that their baby brothers, their twin baby brothers, would come on their birthday. Now, the fact that it's even a possibility that they could have come on their birthday is kind of nuts to me. The fact that I got pregnant at a time when their gestational maturity would have matched anywhere near their twin sister's birthday blows my mind. But that it was actually going to happen kind of didn't seem possible. It was close, but no cigar kind of thing, until my OBGYN started talking about 38 weeks. Well, She had suggested this, floated this idea. Sean and I were praying about it. The twin girls were praying like crazy. Please, please, please let these babies come on our birthday. And so at one point she said, I'm not worried about you specifically, but the more I read the literature, the more nervous I get because there's a higher chance of stillbirth if you go past 38 weeks. And so I said, well, and I know I completely blew her mind. I said, what does 37 weeks and 2 days sound like to you? And she said, well, that's very specific. My OBGYN was a hoot. She swore like a sailor. She was just rough and tough. But I really liked her because she's very straightforward, and I appreciate straightforward, common sense, no nonsense type of people. And so you weren't going to get any hugs or, any soft edges from her. But she looked at me and she said, well, that's a very specific day. Why is that? And I said, well, it's because it's my twin girl's birthday, but it sounds like it's closer to the time frame that you're hoping for, but it gives them more time than 36 weeks to stay in. And I want them to stay in, we could go to 38 weeks. And she's like, oh, no, 37 and 2 sounds great. So she jumped all over that. So I said, well, I would like to have a biophysical sonogram. To be completely honest, because of co-care and because of 2020 being what it was, Texas was much more open than most states and did not have nearly as stringent of laws about medical personnel and husbands and things like that as most states did. But it was still pretty strict, and it was still much more limited, and they were limiting appointments way more than they normally would have for a woman who was 37 years old having her 9th and 10th babies, and they were mono-die twins, which fall into the high risk category by definition, even if your pregnancy doesn't present as high risk. So I had not had that many sonograms. I talked to a friend of mine who had a set of boy-girl twins who are not high risk, other than the fact that they're twins. And she said that they did stress tests on sonograms on her almost every 2 weeks. And so I was grateful not to have been kind of that messed with. But I was surprised by how little I got messed with. There were times when I had to ask them, aren't we supposed to be doing this? And I think to some extent it was just because it was 2020 and procedures were getting dropped and things were falling through the cracks. And thankfully the babies were great. But I had maybe 2 sonograms after that 13-week sonogram before I asked for us to do a complete biophysical sonogram to check their fluid levels, to see if they were practice breathing, to see if there was any kind of weight discrepancy we should worry about, because there's something called twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome that you can have where one gets more nutrients than the other and grows significantly more quickly and the other is sickly. And we hadn't seen any of that, but I just wanted to, you want to make sure, if you can, as much as you can, that everything is safe and ready to go. And so that whole experience is a whole other story. I had to fight this, even though my OBGYN was absolutely all for that. She said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's make sure that they are as ready as they possibly can be at the 36-week mark. And then we'll tentatively schedule this induction. And if for some reason they don't look like they're ready, then we will wait for the 38 weeks. And so we're just praying about this, and I had to fight with this sonogram technician to get them to do this full biophysical sonogram. And I don't like confrontation, and I don't like being like, no, this is what you're supposed to be doing, because I tend to be more of this person's been given their job, let's let them do their job. But somehow the charting had gotten messed up, and she hadn't gotten her information to do a more thorough one. So I ended up asking her for more measurements and asking her to measure the fluid and asking her to check on practice breathing. And they looked perfect. They looked like they were ready to go. So we proceeded. I am having all of the prodromal labor that I normally have, in addition to the creaky joints and the round ligament pain and the pubic bone pain, and just a lot of symptoms piling on top of each other the closer that we get. And even more so than at the 35-week mark or the 32-week mark, every day felt like this thing to make it through. Like one more. And I kept wondering if my body would go into labor spontaneously, because it was contracting so intensely some nights that I'm like, this is it. We're going for it. Well, the closer we got to the hospital birth, the more discomfited I felt about the fact that I had to do this in a hospital. It just felt very impersonal, very clinical. When you have a twin birth, you have to deliver, at least in Texas, and in the hospital that I was in the OR, because if something goes wrong, they want you to be right there to be able to do an emergency C-section. And so I couldn't deliver in a hospital room. I knew it was going to be a very sterile environment. I knew there were going to be a lot of people there, and I typically only want people that absolutely have to be there, but they, by their regulations, had to have like 15 people in the room. And normally there's 3 people in the room other than me. And so I was really dreading this. And so Sean and I went out to eat. He took me to Walmart to get me post-baby snacks to find, treats. And he was doing, he's the best man in the world to me because he's my husband and I love him. But something that he's really good at is when someone's struggling, he looks for very practical ways to encourage them and lift them up and cheer them and distract them. And he's always been that. I don't tend to be too terribly down in the dumps. I'm capable of being negative, of course, but I don't necessarily tend to be a major pessimist. But I couldn't pull myself out of this just mindset of like, this is not what I wanted. And I told you I'd mostly gotten past this and that I had accepted it. But as the closer that it got to reality, the more I dreaded. Not the birth itself, although that sounded a little bit daunting. Like, okay, we've got to get 2 babies out of my body again. But the circumstances being different, and 2020 made it worse. Praise God. My doctor basically said, no, your husband will be in the room. We'll make him scrub up for the OR, but he'll be in the room. Absolutely. That's not going to be a problem. And I will declare your midwife necessary medical personnel, which I'm thinking, thank you. If there's going to be 15 people in the room, please let one of them be the lady that I really want to be there. And so we had our scheduled induction, and I was really contracting a lot. And Sean just kept looking at me like, And I was putting my hand on my stomach like, ugh. And he just kept looking at me with this knowing expression like, uh-huh. And I just kept rolling my eyes at him like, no, we're not doing anything. There's no way that I'm going to go in for an induction and actually just be in labor and go into labor. Although, if you guys have listened to other birth stories, you know that there have been like 3 or 4 times when I've had sonograms at 42 weeks and been in labor and had a baby like the next day or that night. So there maybe is something to my body finally responding to a deadline. Okay, friends, I warned you that it would be a little bit of a cliffhanger. And so we are going to be finishing up this series next week with the portion of this birth story where the Twinbies are actually born. And so you can stay tuned because this story will end, I promise, just like all good stories have to. See you then. If you guys enjoyed today's program, I would be so honored if you would subscribe and share with others. And if you're looking for more daily content on motherhood and biblical responses to cultural issues, you can follow along on Instagram at m.is.for.mama.